Right. Welcome everyone to our webinar. This is Keeping Your Friends Close, Supporting Those Who Support Your Library. I'm Caroline Smith, one of the consultants at the South Carolina State Library. And just a couple quick announcements before we start. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to that recording. You will also receive a link to a survey to give us your feedback and suggestions. And like all of our programs, this webinar is made possible in part by a Library Services and Technology Act grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is administered by us, the South Carolina State Library. And with that, I will turn it over to our speaker today. Welcome. Ben Bullock is here from Together SC, and I'll let you tell us more about yourself and what you do. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Bullock, and I'm the Vice President and COO at Together SC. We are your statewide network for charitable and philanthropic organizations and their allies for good. So you might think of us a bit like a nonprofit chamber of commerce, except we work with 501c3 organizations and those who work with them and love them. And so what I want to talk with you about today is um, working with friends groups, affiliated organizations, particularly in the context of the public library system, which public libraries, of course, as you know, are very unique entities. They're kind of like nonprofits, but they're also county government agencies, and so that they're on a fence, on a borderline there, that can create a little bit of confusion. But we'll try to talk through some of that. Let me start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I am a social worker. I am a public administrator. I am not a lawyer. I did not go to law school. I did not pass the bar exam. I am not qualified in any way to tell you anything about the law. And creating a nonprofit corporation, which is going to be a good chunk of what we're talking about today, is a legal process. But it's also a paperwork process to some degree. And so if you're exploring this option of creating a friends group, or wanting to make sure that you've got everything in order to keep your friends group going from a regulatory standpoint, and you have doubts and questions and concerns, particularly in narrow, very weird legal questions, you should seek guidance from an attorney with nonprofit corporate tax law expertise, and that is not me. But I have been around in this field for about 12 years, and I've worked with nonprofits from all across the state, so I can at least point you in the right direction. But again, if you've got doubts, if you've got real deep legal troubles, you should work with a lawyer on those. So that's my way of saying I'm going to give you my best advice, but don't take me to court over it because I will lose. So I want to just get a sense of who's in the room here. We've got a little crowd, a good intimate crowd today. And so if maybe by a show of hands or using the reaction options here in the chat box, or you can even just type in the chat box, tell me a little bit about yourselves. Are you with a friends group? Are you a staff member at a library? Are you does your library have a current friends group? Is it a system-wide group? Is it branch-based? So if you don't mind popping in the chat box answers to some of these questions, would love to know a little bit more about who we're talking with here. So we've got Josie, who's the branch manager at the Chapin Library. That's Lexington County Public Library, right? And y'all have a friends group that covers your branch. Wonderful. I myself am from Gaston, Swansea, South Carolina, and I, as a young child, volunteered at the Gaston Branch Library. And it's something I'm very proud of. All right, we've got someone on the board of the Friends of the Kershaw County Library. Two people from the board of the Friends of Kershaw County Library. We've got a branch librarian from Boiling Springs and Spartanburg, Abbeville County Library, you've got a friends group, but they're very new, so we want to help make sure they've got things in order. And we've got Jessica from Saluda Library. You're in the process of dismembering. Dismembering. That I've never heard that word used to describe that, but perhaps reinventing your friends group. But I understand that that's going to be a difficult process. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate that insight. That way I can sort of tailor what I'm saying here, making sure that we're covering everything. And if you've got questions that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat. Do the little hand raise option in Zoom, and I am happy to stop and answer questions, because honestly, answering questions is much more fun for me than just reading off a presentation. So here's what we're going to talk about. On the understanding that maybe you're wanting to start a friends group, but even if you're wanting to maintain the group you have, these are some things that you need to know. Asking the key questions about how this group will interact and work with the library is very important. Understanding the regulatory steps to creating and maintaining a nonprofit corporation. All the forms that need to be filed and in what order, and then the heavy lifting. And when I'm talking to folks about starting a new nonprofit organization, oftentimes they have the perspective of, if I could just get through all the paperwork, it will be smooth sailing thereafter. And I am here to tell you that the paperwork is the easiest part. The paperwork comes with instructions. The paperwork comes with people having done it before and experience and all that fun stuff. Paperwork is easy. Building the thing is hard. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, spending a little bit more time on that than perhaps on the paperwork. So, asking ourselves the key questions here. What is the purpose of this friends group? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here with this? Because this is a group that necessarily has a relationship with another entity, being the library, right? And so as much as the Friends of the Library wants to be an independent organization or not, it's still deriving its existence from the library, right? It's fundraising in the name of the library. And so there has to be a good relationship for this to work out, right? We can't have the friends suddenly not be friendly anymore, right? Then they're just of the library, and that's no fun for anyone. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we starting one? Why are we keeping it? What is the group doing? Is it primarily a means of engaging volunteers? Is this so that we can get the community involved in the library? It's a very good reason, right? I mean, we want our libraries to be community organizations. We want them to be hubs and centers for the community to gather and share resources and share information, and connect with each other. And so having a Friends of the Library group is a great vehicle for engaging the community in the library and in identifying good volunteers to help in the library itself. But also it's a way of raising funds, raising private funding, right? County tax money is probably the bread and butter, but it doesn't cover everything, or it can't cover everything that needs in the library's programming. There may be certain programming that the library wants to do that public funds can't go to. And so in order to raise private funds, we may need a separate organization to do that. Is it that we're going to go around with the hat to our community and say, hey, please contribute to the Friends group? Or are we going to strategize about grant opportunities to underwrite some programming for the library? Or let's be honest, is this about the book sale? Libraries can't sell books, but they can leave the books over here in a corner, and the friends can pick them up and sell the books, right? And so, then you've got a transfer of an asset in old books that are out of circulation to another organization who can then convert those books into cash, which ideally should be used for the library. And so there's this back and forth relationship involved in this. And anytime that there's money involved, there is unfortunately the potential for misunderstandings and hurt feelings. And I'll tell you that in talking about starting nonprofits in general, there's a lot of opportunity for misunderstandings and hurt feelings. That's what we want to avoid. And we can avoid this by asking these questions up front and getting a clear understanding of what it is exactly that we're trying to accomplish. I'm not telling you what the right answer is here, by the way. I'm just telling you these are the questions you should ask and have good answers for. And importantly, have answers that everybody agrees on. What resources can the library commit to this, right? This, as I said, it's got to be a two-way relationship. It's got to be a back and forth. It's got to be, and so there's got to be some time that the library is able to commit its own staff and resources to support it, right? So who is that going to be? What will the staff and leadership of the library be responsible for? And not just the professional staff, but also the board leadership of the library. And we'll talk about that a little bit further down in the presentation. But who's going to be the primary manager of that relationship? Who's going to be the liaison to the Friends group? And then how independent is this Friends group going to be? In terms of formal independence, you may end up creating a full-fledged nonprofit corporation with its own board of directors and policies and all sorts of things that need to be done to maintain a nonprofit corporation. And it may have its own completely independent board of directors. But, there are ways in which the two organizations can be more integrated and connected to each other. And I've seen it done in a number of different ways. Richland Library, for example, has merged its Friends of the Richland Library and its Richland Library Foundation together into the Friends and Foundation of Richland Library, or something along those lines, right? And some portion of the library's development staff serve as the staff of that organization, right? And so it can go a whole number of different ways. And even so, even if a Friends group is legally completely independent of the library, there's still the fact that the nature of this organization's existence is its relationship to the library. And without that relationship, that reason for existence goes away. And so, again, it's important to make sure that this relationship is strong and on a good, solid foundation. So, talking about the regulatory steps here. And this is the part of the presentation that I usually spend a lot of time going over because, hey, it's paperwork. I'm not going to spend that much time on this. But if you're going to start a new Friends group as an independent corporation, the first thing you need to do is file for an employer ID number. This is like the social security number for corporations, right? You may remember some politician once said, corporations are people too, my friend. Well, he's right, because they have their own social security numbers. I mean, employer ID numbers with the IRS. And so in order to have a corporate entity, that corporate entity needs an employer ID number, even if they have no employees. It's still called an employer ID number. It's really easy to get one. It's an online form on the IRS website. You do not pay for it. It's free. You put in the information about the entity that you're trying to create, and it will magically spit out a 10-digit number for you. And then you're ready to go. If you find that somebody's asking for your credit card number to file this form, you're on the wrong website. And once you've got that number in hand, put that in a binder somewhere. It's important, don't lose it. You'll need to begin the process of incorporating in the state of South Carolina, registering a corporation with the Secretary of State's office. And this is done by filing articles of incorporation. And I've got the link to that here. It can be done online. All of this can be done online now. It's very amazing, this modern age we live in. And you can even pay online. And the cost of filing the form is $25. And despite being called articles of incorporation, it's a form. You've got some leeway in what you put in there. There are questions that have to be asked, particularly around, what's the name of the organization? What's the address? Where are we sending the mail to? Who's the registered agent? And all of these things can be changed further down the road. It's just more paperwork. But there are some questions about, will this corporation have members? And that's an important question to be clear on, because you may have members who contribute, but don't get to vote for the board of directors, and they don't get to vote on the dissolution of the corporation. Those aren't members from a legal standpoint. Legal, remember, I'm not a lawyer. Those are donors. It's like the ETV endowment, right? I pay my $10 a month to the ETV endowment, and I'm a sustaining star, and I'm a member. I don't get to vote for their board of directors. They've never once asked me about that, and quite frankly, I don't care to vote for their board of directors. I trust that they've got a good board, and I don't need to be involved in that decision. I'm not a legal member of the ETV endowment, no matter what fancy decals and mugs and tote bags they may send to me every year because of my contributions. I'm a donor. But I feel good about being called a sustaining star member, right? Conversely, Together SC, the State Association of Charitable and Philanthropic Nonprofit Organizations, is a true association. Our member organizations have the right to vote for the board of directors. They have the right to vote on certain important questions about the disposition of the corporation. And so that question on that form, will this corporation have members, is very important to answer correctly. If you choose the wrong answer, it requires paperwork and legal wrangling and a vote of those members to change it. And I'm not telling you which one's the right answer, because it depends on the circumstances. But if you meant to choose one and you choose the other, it could lead to problems down the road. Another question that's on this form has to do with, in the event of dissolution, what happens to the remaining assets? Depending on the circumstances, there may be another nonprofit organization, maybe like the Literacy Council or something like that, if not the library itself, right? It's important because if people have donated money to this group and then the group no longer exists for whatever reason, those donations need to go to a purpose related to what those donors intended. And so the form will ask you to name an organization. Well, it'll give you two options. It'll say you can let the courts decide, or you can name an organization. Personally, between y'all and me, I would rather choose what happens rather than leave it up to the courts. And I think the courts would rather you choose as well. So those are some of the questions that get asked on there. It's very important to understand what those questions mean and to answer them in a way that fits the circumstances of your situation. And then once you've filed that articles of incorporation, if you file it online, it may happen faster. If you file it in the mail, it may take a couple of days or weeks. The Secretary of State's office cannot deny it. It's not in the sense of it's not an application, it's a filing. The only reason why they would deny it really is if you didn't answer a question or you left something blank that you should have filled in, or some kind of technical reason. They can't just go, oh, we don't like this idea, we're not going to approve it. But they'll send you back a certificate, and it will have the very amusing title of Certificate of Existence. And there you go. Congratulations, you have a baby corporation. Now you have to feed and love and care it for 18 years until it's fully grown. But then you have to file charitable registration. And this is an annual filing that has to be done. And depending on the circumstances, you need to file it quickly, immediately. Because if you don't file it and then you go out into the world and start asking people to donate money, the Secretary of State's office just might think that perhaps you're panhandling, which is illegal. And so you do have to register a charity with the Secretary of State's office. There are some exemptions. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it's a $50 filing. You do have to submit financial statements, depending again on the circumstances, how much or how little of a financial statement you have to submit. It depends. There are exemptions. You don't have to register if the organization has 501c3 status and no one in the organization, and by the organization I mean the Friends group, not the library, no one in the organization is compensated more than $500 a year. So if you don't have any professional fundraisers or anyone being paid to do work for the organization, not more than $500 anyway, and the organization hasn't received or solicited 20K in a calendar year, that's one circumstance. Or it's a charitable organization that didn't receive more than $7,500 in the calendar year. There are other exemptions, by the way. These are just the two most common ones that nonprofits I work with encounter. So if you're below these financial thresholds and you meet these criteria here, you can file the exemption form. You still have to file a form. There's no getting out of filing a form. It's just you can file an exemption form and not pay $50, and then you're okay. But you got to file one of the two of these, and you got to do it every year. And all right, there we go. And then once all of that's said and done, there's the federal form, and this is what is the 501c3 magical combination of letters and numbers that allows a charitable organization to call itself a charitable organization and to be tax exempt on the income taxes and to grant to its donors a deduction on their taxes for their contributions. And this is important here. Charitable, religious, educational, scientific, literary, testing for public safety, fostering amateur sports competition, or working to prevent cruelty to children or animals. That is the definition of charitable, right? There are 27 or 28 different 501c sections. 75% of all tax-exempt organizations fall into section 501c3. Go figure. It's the most advantageous of the tax-exempt statuses, right? Well, to some degree. But with that extra being able to give a deduction on the donations comes some restrictions on activities, right? An organization can't have 501c3 status if a substantial portion of its activities involve attempting to influence legislation or participate for or against a candidate for public office. That's the Johnson Amendment. That doesn't mean that it can't lobby. It doesn't mean that it can't, go to county council and say, hey, we want to achieve this certain goal on behalf of the library. Certainly they can do that. It just can't be a substantial portion of its activities. So bear that in mind. And substantial portion can be measured a couple of different ways, and I'm not going to get into that here. But one of those ways is just a pure, how much money did you spend on it? And if you're really just relying on volunteers and, if all you're doing is going to county council and talking to them about it, that probably doesn't count as substantial. But again, double check with lawyers. And of course, the assets of the organization have to be permanently dedicated to its exempt purpose, supporting the library, for example. So that's the requirement to get 501c3 status. The form is IRS Form 1023. Now be careful. 1023 is for 501c3 organizations. 1024 is for all other 501c organizations. So, 3, 4, 3 is the one you want. 3 for 501c3. And it's a 33 long page form that takes a good deal of time and energy to fill out. And you probably don't need to fill it out because there is the 1023EZ. It's an online form. It's only 3 pages. It doesn't ask as many questions. However, in order to file it, an organization needs to not receive more than 50K in gross receipts over the next 3 years. It needs to not already have 250K in assets in the bank. There are some other questions that have to be answered correctly in order to qualify. But the sense of this is, if this new organization is starting out with absolutely nothing in the bank account and is probably not, having rich Uncle Moneybags or Elon Musk standing in the wings ready to make a giant contribution, you can probably file the Form 1023EZ. It costs, there is a filing fee, $275 to file it, and you have to file it within 27 months from the filing of the Articles of Incorporation in order for that tax exemption to be retroactive to the incorporation. So you got a wide window to get this form in. I wouldn't let too much time pass in between filing these forms. But you've got some time. There's some other filings, particularly relevant to the book sale is the sales tax exemption. So if you're going to be doing the book sale on a quarterly basis and you don't want to have to deal with collecting sales taxes for it, you're probably going to want to get that sales tax exemption from the State Department of Revenue. If you're going to be raising funds through a raffle or anything like that, I don't know, it could happen, right? There are rules around it, and they have to be adhered to very strictly. This was something Together SC worked on a couple of years ago. We had to pass a constitutional amendment in order to allow nonprofits to hold raffle fundraisers. Now you may say, Ben, we held a raffle fundraiser back in 1985 and there was no problem. Well, it wasn't a problem until the county sheriff showed up and confiscated the proceeds, right? Because it was not legal at that time. People just did it anyway. And it wasn't really until people started cracking down on it that we were like, okay, we really have to legalize this. So that happened a couple of years ago. There are rules and regulations around it, paperwork that has to be filed with the Secretary of State's office. So annual filings. You may say, oh, well, hey, this is a tax-exempt organization. What do you mean we got to file a tax return? You got to file a tax return, even if you're not paying any income taxes, right? And so chances are, if this organization is not raising any more than 50K a year, then you file the Form 990N e-postcard. It doesn't ask for any financial reports, it just asks for the name of the current contacts and officers of the organization, and it's an online form and it's free. Don't let anyone charge you to file this form. But it takes 10 minutes and it's easy to do, but you've got to do it every year. Now, once you start getting over this 50K threshold, you're in, the in between 50K and 200K a year, then you got to file the next form up, and it does ask for financial information, but it could still reasonably be filled out by a lay person who's not a CPA. But if you're in the upper end of that, you probably do want to get a CPA involved. If we've got a Friends of the Library group that's raising more than 200K a year, we need to talk. But hey, anything's possible. But at that point, you can afford an accountant to do it for you. But these forms have to be filed with the IRS, the South Carolina Department of Revenue, and the South Carolina Secretary of State's office. In the event of the 990N and you're in that weird window between 25K and 50K, where you don't qualify for the exemption with the Secretary of State's office, but you don't file financial information with the 990, there is a special form that the Secretary of State's office will have you fill out to submit for your financial report. And the charitable registration, again, this has to be done every year. Now, let me just say this. If you don't file a Form 990 every year, after the third year, the IRS will automatically revoke the 501c3 status. And they'll try to send you letters, but don't rely on those letters to arrive. And so you may find yourself in a situation, particularly in a volunteer-run organization, where somebody was supposed to file that 990N e-postcard and forgot, and who has the username and password and all that stuff. If you don't do that 3 years in a row, that tax status will be revoked, and you have to go through this entire rigmarole all over again in order to get it back. And there is no appeal. There is no appeal at all. It just happens. The computer does it, and you just got to start over. So beware. So just to recap on this, it's a back and forth between the IRS and the Secretary of State's office. You get the EIN from the IRS. You incorporate with the business filings division at the Secretary of State's office. You file the Form 1023 with the IRS. You get the charity registration or exemption from the charities division at the Secretary of State's office. And that's the process. Bit like volleyball. Any questions on that before we move on? I know that was a massive info dump. It always is every time I do this presentation. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, but feel free to pop your questions in as you get going. So you've created a nonprofit organization, an affiliated group to help out the library. Yeah, we can provide the slides afterwards, absolutely. So you've created a new nonprofit corporation, or hey, you've got one and you're trying to figure out how to get it going again. Here's some things to remember. It has to have a board of directors. That's the law. There's no way around this. You got to have a board of directors because it's a corporation. And corporations are governed by boards of directors. And it's important to know that, and this is, I'm saying this more for the Friends group members on the call, nobody owns it. It is not the library, not the board, not the founder. It is a public trust. And it owns itself. And so I always caution folks who start nonprofits and they say things like, oh, I own a nonprofit. No, you don't own it. If anything, it owns you for as long as you're involved with it. And labor of love and all that. But 501c3s are corporations and they're tax exempt on income taxes and maybe property taxes and a few other things. But you know, nonprofits are not exempt from every tax. Like nonprofits still pay taxes. We pay payroll taxes. We pay unemployment taxes. We pay all kinds of other fun taxes. Sales taxes. In South Carolina, there is not an exemption for nonprofits on sales tax for things they purchase, only on things they sell. And so, you know, there's still taxes that have to be paid, but the big ones we're tax exempt from. And, you know, all of this means that around 51 billion, this number's probably gone up. This was a couple of years ago when I got this number. At least 51 billion a year that the federal government does not get in taxes because of this tax exemption. And so this board of directors exists to manage the public trust involved in this. And so in South Carolina, the minimum number is 3. I don't recommend a board of 3 people because You don't get enough diversity of thought. You either have three people who can never agree on anything and are constantly in a stalemate, or you have three board members who agree on everything and miss important things to be worried about. So I think 5 to 7 is a good range. You don't really want to get too much more than that, because then you start to run into problems of getting everybody in the same room at the same time. And I've seen nonprofits that have boards of like 50 people, and I think to myself, that's bigger than the state senate. So we don't want to let them get that big. But board members have to understand their legal and fiduciary responsibilities. There are some liabilities involved, personal liabilities involved in being a nonprofit board member. And so making sure that folks are aware of those liabilities before they sign on, making sure that there's appropriate insurance coverage is important. Talk about that in a minute. But most importantly here, what is this board's relationship to the library? Because for every nonprofit corporation, but for especially volunteer-run nonprofit corporations, the board is the corporation, right? The board is the entity here. And so what is that board's relationship to the library? Is it a committee of the library board? I mean, I could see circumstances where, the library creates a friends group, and then we've just got a committee of the library board that serves as the board of the friends group. Now, that's pretty much fully integrating it into the operations of the library. There might be some problems with that. Is there some overlap? You have a setup where maybe a quarter or half of the library friends group are coming from the library board itself, and some of them are not library board members and are independent from the community. That's a possibility. More likely is that the board of the friends group is completely independent. But then how are these independent members being selected? And is it coming from a membership? If it has a voting membership, like I talked about earlier, do those members choose among themselves and elect a board? Or is there not a voting membership to speak of, and this board has to decide for itself who's rolling on and who's rolling off? What are the term limits? You don't want somebody serving on a nonprofit board for 30-something years. Eventually they get tired, and eventually perhaps other people get tired of them. And so you want to be careful not to wear folks out. And term limits are a great way of ensuring that we've got a good cycle of people coming in and also of people getting a break. And so the standard, I would say, is a maximum of 2 3-year terms. No more than 6 years on the board is pretty much standard. I've seen it longer and shorter, but most nonprofits go for the 2 3-year term rule. And all of that's detailed in bylaws. Got to have bylaws. Bylaws are, some people may say, oh, it's the constitution of the organization. That's pretty much what bylaws are. It used to be that organizations would have a separate constitution and separate bylaws. In this modern day, they're just really the same thing. And so you've got to have bylaws to govern the basic aspects of the corporation. How are directors elected? Some of these questions I just asked. How often do the board of directors meet? What are the notice requirements? What are the officers? Legally, you've got to have a president, you got to have a secretary, and you got to have a treasurer. Those three are required by the South Carolina Nonprofit Corporation Act. But some have an immediate past president. Some have a president-elect or a vice president. Some have other officers, depending on the circumstances. And so the bylaws will detail who these officers are and what their duties are. Um, so you've got to have that spelled out. Now, there are samples all over the internet of nonprofit bylaws. But what's really important is if you use a sample of bylaws, make sure that you don't just take the old organization's name off and slap yours on and call it good. You really want to read through it, understand it, make what edits are necessary to fit the circumstances of the organization without going against state law. But you want to make sure that you make those bylaws your own. And hey, circumstances may change over the years, right? You may have it one way and then find 10 years down the road that it's good to do an update and a refresh and shuffle some things around to make it work in the new era. So bylaws are a living document, but they do generally require a little bit of difficulty to change, right? Most bylaws will say, hey, if we're going to change the bylaws, we have to have 2 weeks notice for the board, and it has to be passed by a majority of board members in office, not just a majority of those who show up for the meeting. Having good bylaws are important. Having a case for support is vital for any nonprofit organization, because once you've gone through all this process of creating the thing, you have to ask people for money, right? That's just a part of being a nonprofit corporation. You got to go out with your hat and ask people to give. It's the bread and butter. So case for support is easy when we're talking about the Friends of the Library, right? You've already got it. The case for support is we want to do great things at the library. We want to have literacy programs. We want to have community engagement. We want to do all these great and wonderful things in the library and make our library the best that it can be. And that's what we're here for. Boom, there's your case of support. Put it on a one-pager and talk about, $10 will buy, $10 will buy a new book for the library. I don't know. $150 will buy a cheap computer for the library. Like all these sorts of things that could be done generally are in a case for support. Business planning is more for organizations with professional staff and large budgets. So you probably don't have to worry about that so much. But just so you know, if the idea is, we're going to go out and get a bunch of grants, just beware that grants are not a huge part of the picture for most nonprofits, and even Friends of the Library groups. Like, there may be grants available, but grants are a small portion of the pie. Donations are, for most nonprofits, the bread and butter. But fees for service are increasingly the largest portion of the pie. And I hear people say all the time, well, nonprofits can't charge for their services. Oh, yes, they can. And many do. Sliding scales are also a thing. But again, many friends groups have the book sale, and there you go. You're engaging in a commercial activity that is related to your exempt purpose. I should give the warning. You can't engage in a commercial activity that is not related to your exempt purpose. So you can sell books, but I would probably stay away from selling spaghetti or something that doesn't have anything to do with literacy and libraries and community centers and things like that. Because if you do, you run afoul of what's called the unrelated business income tax. So beware. So effective management, making sure that we've got good financial systems, right? Because if you're going to start raising money, be it grants or donations or book sales, that money has to go somewhere, right? It can't just go into the chair's pocketbook, right? Listen, I have seen it happen in unincorporated associations where the treasurer just keeps the cash in a box. Probably not the best idea. right? Something could happen to that. The chair could go off on a holiday, the treasurer could go off to Bermuda and you never see them again, right? We want to make sure there are good systems in place for tracking the funds, and for having a bank account, right? And so the question is okay, is this something that the library takes on? Like, does the library serve as fiscal sponsor for the Friends Group? And does the library maintain a separate bank account for the Friends Group that is just that there, and the library can't really touch the funds without approval from the Friends Group, right? That's one way of possibly doing it. But then again, if the Friends Group is fully independent, then you've got volunteers who are managing this bank account, right? And you've got a rotating cast of volunteers who are managing these things. And that, volunteers are, there is potential for accidents to occur, right? I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything untoward, right? But even with the best of intentions, volunteers usually have day jobs or other things that they have to take care of too, and sometimes we forget to file things, and we forget to do things, and we forget to make deposits, and so making sure that there are strong procedures in place with checks and double checks, particularly in a volunteer-run group, so that that poor treasurer doesn't have complete and total control. Because if I was a treasurer of a volunteer-run organization, I would not want complete and total control, because I would not want anybody to say, Ben's got all the money and what's he doing with it? I don't want that. I don't even want that shadow on me, right? So you want to make sure that if you've got a treasurer, you've got a financial secretary, and you've got the president all looking at the finances together, so that each one can hold the other accountable. And having good internal controls helps do that. Making sure that the board adopts an annual budget to hold themselves accountable to is very important. Making sure that the board has good insurance coverage. I talked about this earlier, that boards have liability. They have inherent liability to serving on a board. Now, there's some charitable immunity, but that only goes so far. Directors and officers insurance at a minimum is a good thing to have. And making sure that, when you're filing the IRS Form 990, if you're filing the full or some variation of it, that you've got policies and procedures for conflicts of interests, for whistleblower policy, and those sorts of things are important to have as well. And again, I go back to that first question: what is the role of the host library in this? Right? Is there some portion of library staff time dedicated to helping the Friends Group manage this stuff? It's something to think about and something to consider, but very important that whatever is decided, there's a process that is written down and everybody's held accountable for it. Oops. So, keys to success here: having a very strong, defined relationship between the Friends and the library, right? Especially if the Friends Group is fully independent, they're still using the library's name to raise money, right? And they're still doing it for the library, right? And so if this relationship is not kept good, there's no point, right? There's no point to it unless the relationship is good. And so you can keep this relationship strong with ongoing, honest communication, right? The library staff being clear about what the needs are, the Friends Group being clear about what they're trying to accomplish, hand in hand, arm in arm, kumbaya with the library. And we do this with good communication. We do this with transparent financial reporting. We get full participation in fundraising activities. Like, part of the reason why we have the Friends Group is there's a limitation on what the library staff can do, right? And so we need help from volunteers to help raise funds, right? And so if you've got board members who aren't helping with fundraising, if they're not serving an equally important role in the board, then maybe they need to find some other way to contribute. And so we want to make sure that the board is fulfilling its governing and fiduciary responsibilities for itself, right? Keeping open communication with the community. Hard to ask a community to contribute and participate and get involved if they don't know what you're doing with their money, right? And so being open with the community about what you're trying to accomplish. Evaluating your programs, evaluating your activity. Hey, are we doing this the right way? Are we having the impact, the effect that we want to have for the library and for the community through the work that we're doing? Or are we actually accidentally, unintentionally making things worse? It happens. It happens. Read Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton, and he'll go through a whole thing about ways in which charitable nonprofit organizations think that they're doing good, but are actually making the problem worse through their activities because they're not evaluating themselves. They're not checking the outcomes. So, and of course, Together SC publishes guiding principles and best practices for nonprofits here in South Carolina. It is a one size fits all guide. However, I would say for organizations at the smaller end of size, you don't have to do everything in it, right? It's about doing the best that you can, about being as transparent as you can, about communicating as good as you can with the community and with the library. So some other helpful resources we have at Together SC. We have a bi-weekly newsletter that goes out. So libraries can be members of Together SC either as a nonprofit or as a government partner. And many of the county libraries are. But also the friends groups can be members of Together SC as independent nonprofit organizations. And so I invite you to consider joining Together SC as members in order to connect with other nonprofits in your community, in order to connect with other nonprofits across the state, to learn and connect with each other. Of course, information is available at the IRS, the Secretary of State's office. The National Council of Nonprofits is our national association. And there's great resources at the Nonprofit Management Library and BoardSource as well. So with that, that's my spiel. I am happy to answer questions that folks may have about these processes and what you're looking for here.
And you are welcome to type your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you have any.
Quick question. Do you recommend a MOU with the Friends group?
That's a great way of memorializing the relationship, right? And you know, I mean, yeah, I would say an MOU would be a great way of doing that. I mean, again, you want to have a legal counsel anytime you're doing a contract or anything like that. If you've got legal counsel, access to that would be good. To some extent, that stuff can be covered in the bylaws as well, but the bylaws are for the organization itself, and so. Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of that idea, but that's an excellent idea. I mean, having an MOU to say here's what each side is going to do for this relationship is a great way of keeping things on track.
Okay. I didn't in my last place, and I don't know it's always necessary, but I have heard horror stories, so that's why I was checking to see. My other question is, in my former library, I've not done it here because they're so new. I asked my friend's president serve on my board as I can't talk.
Ex
Unofficial
officio?
ex officio. Thank you. I swear my mind's gone. Ex officio member. So they knew what was going on and could bring it back. Is that a good idea? Bad idea? Does it?
I mean, it helps
matter?
keep the communication open, right?
Right.
It's a way to keep the communication open. I mean, if you've got that kind of influence on, I mean, I know with the library boards, In many cases, you know, depending on your county council and how those board members are elected or appointed, you know, it depends depending on what kind of influence you have. But if you're able to, with your board, with the library board, say, hey, can we, you know, even as an ex officio non-voting member, let the
Right.
Friends president attend the meeting so that they can report to the library board about what the Friends group is doing, and so that they can then report to the Friends group what the library board is doing. You know,
I hadn't
there's
thought about the council part of it. I just sort of did it because I figured our meetings are open to the public, so it shouldn't matter, but I hadn't thought about that aspect of it. But
well, and I mean, you know, what ex officio, I mean, so people think that ex officio necessarily means non-voting, and those are actually two separate things, right? So
okay,
ex officio simply says this person is a member of a body not because of who they are, but because of what office they occupy. And the moment they don't occupy that office, they are no longer a member of this body. Whoever
right.
occupies that office is a member of the body. That's what ex officio means. Non voting means that this person has the right to speak at the meeting, as if they were a full voting board member. They just don't get to vote. And so members of the public may get to attend meetings of the library board, but they certainly don't have necessarily the right to speak at that meeting unless the board has granted a certain time for them to do so. So there's different ways you can structure it, right? But if you want someone to be ex officio and non-voting,
That's what they want.
then that means that they have rights to speak by virtue of their position, but not to vote.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, I think that's a great idea. And again, we want to keep communication lines open. That's how we have a good relationship.
And honestly, that was the main purpose. And I had some board Friends presidents that were there on a regular basis, and some that showed up once a year maybe. So it was sort of hit and miss, but at least we tried to keep it going.
Yeah, and as I was trying to think over, you know, the way different ways in these which these things can be set up, you know, and again, there may be legal issues with how the libraries themselves exist that could be impediments to this that I don't know anything about. But you know, do you have certain library board members sit on the Friends board as a way of fostering that connection as well? You know, that's certainly an option, I think, depending on circumstances.
Thank you.
Hmm.
All right, any other questions? We have about 1 minute left. Okay, I don't see anything. So thank you so much for your time, Ben, and for being here with us. And thank you to all our participants. We will send out an email with the slides and the recording, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.